Hello and welcome to our Week 5 seminar on Indigenous peoples and the hegemony of Anglo culture. In this week's seminar, we will review Indigenous peoples and lessons learned for education. This has been brought to you by Allison, Mark, Terri-lyn, and Vicki. Welcome. In our seminar for this week, we will review 3 bodies of work. As we do that, we ask you to consider what is hegemony. In case you're not familiar with what that term means, it does mean leadership or dominance by one country or social group over another. Here we will look at first an article by Herbert C. Northcott called Going Native, A White Guy's Experience Teaching in an Aboriginal Context. Next, we will look at a CBC documentary called Colonization Role. And finally, we will review an article by John Minnis. There, he explored, is decolonization the answer to Indigenous underachievement, comparing rhetoric with reality in New Zealand and Canada. First, let's have a look at Herbert C. Northcott's article, Going Native, A White Guy's Experience in an Aboriginal Context. Here, what Northcott does for us is provide his experience being a white guy, using white textbooks and a white pedagogy, and he found that this did not seem to serve his Aboriginal students well. So, what Northcott decided to do was replace the typical Euro-Canadian pedagogy, so for example, lectures that are given from the front of the classroom, with a more native-centered pedagogy. For Northcott, what this meant was exploring pedagogy in using Aboriginal pedagogy so that it involved not lecturing at the front of the room at all times and instead facilitating discussion in a non-obtrusive manner. This also meant that the students and instructor sat in a circle. In Northcott's case, this actually meant 2 concentric circles, given the number of students. And this also meant emphasizing oral communication and personal student experience. For Northcott, this also meant that learning became a cooperative exercise, and he found that his students were then sharing more. In Northcott's article, he takes us through his experience of being a white guy at the University of Alberta and teaching Aboriginal students, and he shares with us what it was like to teach there. What he tells us is that while Aboriginal culture acknowledges differential strengths and that these are to be used for the benefit of the community and not for individual self-aggrandizement, he notes that this is quite different than what we're used to, which is the Euro-Canadian ethic of individualistic competition, which is typically used for the purpose of identifying the strongest seemed foreign and hostile to the Aboriginal students. What we'd encourage you to consider is, does this sound familiar? Have you noticed an individualistic competition in your classroom or in your workplace? Further, what Northcott asks us to consider is that in Cree, the concept of chief was contained in a phrase rather than a word, and the phrase was rendered as the person who is temporarily in charge of this particular situation. Furthermore, it was expected that the headman would put the interests of all others ahead of his own. This reminded us of what we've heard about in adult education in terms of not always being the sage on the stage, sometimes being the guide on the side. And we'd encourage you to think about whether or not you've tried this in your teaching. Have you tried being the guide on the side as opposed to the sage on the stage, which is what Aboriginal pedagogy has known for quite a long time? In terms of considering some lessons learned from Northcott's article, we'd first ask you to consider, should learning be cooperative? And in fact, we do this in this class. So instead of every week's class being led solely by one instructor, by Allison Emer taking charge of the class every time and only being the only person to talk, Allison Emer accomplishes cooperative learning, where we're all given an opportunity to share in breakout groups, in discussion. Some other lessons learned are to look for new ways to evaluate students. It does not always need to be multi-choice or exams. And we in fact do this in this course as well, where we're given an opportunity to do these seminars, to share with one another through Wikipedia. One factor that Northcott quite accurately considers, though, is that that type of evaluating students could certainly take more time. So we'd ask you to consider that as well. A key factor in Northcott's article is to look for ways for your students to lead discussions, collaborate, and cooperate. And so if this is quite new to you, it's something to consider as being related to Aboriginal pedagogy. Next, let's review the CBC documentary Colonization Road. Here, comedian Ryan McMahon travels Ontario's colonization roads to explore the impact of these networks framed within comedy. So he does quite an excellent job of showing us where colonization roads are, and he does this with a comedic tone. In doing this, Ryan is consistently taking us back to the fact that colonization impacts exist today. And one of the key examples of this is a quote and a video of Stephen Harper, our former Prime Minister, stating that we have no history of colonialism. Here, Ryan McMahon discusses the impact of colonization on Indigenous peoples, the fact that it still impacts them and us today. What happened with colonization was the disposition and the dispossession of people, land, and resources through policy, violence, and racism. Colonization Road, to be clear, was a road system that was built to populate areas across Manitoba and Ontario. And one of the outcomes of this that exists today and that we need to acknowledge is that Indigenous peoples are accepted as long as they don't rock the boat, as long as they know their place, and as long as they do not talk about land claims, treaty rights. This is something to consider as we instruct in our classrooms. Further, as Patrick Wolf is quoted as saying in the documentary, colonization is a structure. It is not an event. It is an ongoing process that we reproduce every day through our actions. And so this is something to consider as we teach in our classrooms, that it still exists.
There are many lessons to take away from this video. The overarching lesson, I think, here is that we as a society needs to understand the implication of acquiring Indigenous territory without their consent, and then the resulting displacement and disposition of our people. It's also important to recognize that colonization happened and it continues to exist in our society, and how do we evaluate our role in this? We cannot acknowledge missing and murdered Indigenous women. We cannot talk about reconciliation, or we cannot talk about residential schools if we don't acknowledge that there was land taken away from Indigenous people. And if we don't talk about the deeply entrenched racism and how that is perpetuated in our society. We also need to look at what responsibility do we have to unlearn many of the things that we have learned about the Indigenous people, and how to now relearn. And so why is it important to acknowledge the traditional lands? A territorial or land acknowledgement is an act of reconciliation that involves making a statement recognizing the traditional territory of the Indigenous people who called the land home before the arrival of settlers, and in many cases still do call it home. Its purpose is to recognize that we, as settlers and as people who are not part of First Nations or Indigenous groups, are here on Indigenous land. Land acknowledgements have become increasingly common in non-Indigenous spaces in the last few years, especially since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Residential Schools released its 94 calls to action in 2015. So as someone who lives in the Durham region, it is important that I recognize that I exist and I live on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog First Nation. The impact of treaty making in Canada has been wide-ranging and long-standing. The treaties the Crown has signed with Indigenous people since the 18th century have permitted the evolution of Canada as we know it. In fact, much of Canada's landmass is covered by treaties. This treaty-making process, which has evolved over more than 300 years between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada, has its origins in the early diplomatic relationship developed between European settlers and the Indigenous people. These diplomatic proceedings were the first steps in a long process that has led to today's comprehensive claim agreements between the Crown and the Indigenous people. Currently, there are approximately 70 recognized treaties that form the basis of the relationship between 364 First Nations, representing over 600,000 First Nation people, and the Crown. It should be noted that Indigenous people are signing treaties even today and that there are over 500 land claim settlements which needs to be resolved. So let's talk a little bit about the medicine wheel. It is noted throughout this video that within the Indigenous culture, the land is respected and connected to all aspects of life and is best reflected in the medicine wheel. The physical quadrant, tobacco is the first medicine that is given from the Creator as per the Indigenous culture, and it is in the east and represents the promise that the Creator is always listening. The mental quadrant, sweetgrass is in the south and it is connected to Mother Earth. The emotional quadrant, sage is in the west, and as the Indigenous people move into adult stage of life, they exist through the west, and sage assists in that journey. The spiritual quadrant, cedar is placed in the north, and while their Mother Earth sleeps, cedar stays green and symbolizes that their Mother Earth watches over and protects Indigenous people.
Hi, so this is Terri-lyn here. The third piece we will be discussing in this presentation is the one by Dr. John Minnis. From all of our research about him, we could only find that he was an accredited professor in sociology and adult education at University College of the North in Nepal, Manitoba, which serves a very large population of Native Canadian students. This is important because we were absolutely appalled by his white guy perspective, whether he actually is or not, we're not sure, in writing this article, and we decided to use his key points to launch our counter-arguments in the defense of decolonization. Basically, in his literature review, he highlights the beliefs held by Indigenous scholars and advocates that Aboriginal students are being failed by the school system because their culture and languages are underrepresented in curriculum and their voices are not heard at an organizational level. Yes, we've heard about this. However, he argues that if this is in fact the problem, then with the changes that have taken place in recent years to policies and educational systems in Canada, we should have already seen greater progress towards Aboriginal education attainment and success. He therefore believes that decolonization in education is not the answer and is in fact counterproductive to overcoming characteristics of neocolonialism, such as unemployment, institutional racism, and alienation. So he's not saying that there is no problem with Aboriginal education. He's just saying that decolonization is not the answer. But he gets infuriatingly opinionated, especially near the end, going so far as to call out an Aboriginal obsession with culture. It's almost as if he would like Aboriginals to get over the past so that they can continue their plight to better themselves. Specifically, Minnis argues that the current Eurocentric education system should not be adapted because its literacy levels and the academic credentials associated with it are globally valuable in, as he puts it, the real world, the way it is. In fact, this system is essential to democracy and the fight against unemployment and poverty. In making this argument, he fails to recognize any value that can be placed on Aboriginal teaching methods, many of which we've adopted into our Eurocentric education system under the guise of constructivism and other pedagogical terms that speak for guided learning, community building, self-regulation, and hands-on experience, all of which are being recognized as important globally. And who's to say that long and formal education can't include some of these key skills? We already know Northcott's doing it. Instead, he blames families for problems with Aboriginal academic achievement, neglecting to address that if there are broken support systems when it comes to perceptions of academics in Aboriginal communities, then we, the white people, only have ourselves and our history of residential schooling to blame. The other point I wanted to discuss is how Minnis does not believe that ethnicity can determine how you learn. This has been a topic of debate in Canada in the last decade or so, and not just surrounding Aboriginal education. He argues that rather than recognizing and allowing First Nations people to identify as such and healing their self-esteem through opportunities to make that identification within education, We should instead be helping Aboriginal students identify with the social groups of modern society, or they'll never be able to achieve success. However, the ideal he describes is valuable only to someone looking through a white lens. He's talking about making Aboriginal students competitive, something that Northcott students did not fully believe in. He's also talking about helping them identify with the melting pot of society, which is exactly what they, as a culture, have been trying to free themselves of. First Nations people in Canada have historically been forced to identify with modern society, which is what is essentially responsible for their low self-esteem with regards to their ancestral race today. Once again, he expects history and its effects to be overlooked in order to move forward and forget. Now, Mark is going to talk about a couple more of Minnis's key points that are equally frustrating.
The focus of this section will be looking at the Minnis article. This video will offer critique of his arguments about First Nations educational funding and the idea that First Nations people are more successful when they live away from their home communities. In the article, Minnis stated that First Nations education receives a lot of federal funding. This is obviously a true statement when you look at the entire amount. Over the next 4 to 5 years, the federal government plans on putting $2.6 billion into First Nations education. Minnis, therefore, does not believe that the lack of funding can be connected to educational achievement. In fact, he stated that the underfunding is simply part of the political struggle between First Nations and the government. So is it really this simple? Since First Nations communities receive this funding, Minnis would argue, they should not be able to connect educational achievement to the funding issue. Well, let's look at this in more detail. First, many First Nations communities are in block-funded agreements with the government. Block funding is when the government and the community agree to a set of money over a 5-year period. Although this may seem great for some departments, in an educational institution, it can be very difficult to plan the needs of your students over a 5-year span. Also, the majority of this money cannot be increased once it has been agreed upon. Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, or INAC, has established a 2% inflation rate for each year in the agreement. Once again, not taking into consideration student needs. Throughout the article, Minnis also discusses Indigenous elites. He mentions that these powerful people or groups do not have to be accountable to anyone, whether that's the government or community members. It seems like this point is not justified. In order for First Nations communities to receive any additional funding support, they are required to write proposals. These proposals are sent to Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, or INAC, to be reviewed, accepted, rejected, or modified. In these proposals, communities must state how much money they need with justification. They are then mandated to prove how the funds were spent. Doesn't this seem like accountability? The other issue with the proposal-based funding program is that it puts communities in competition for the same money, something that goes against Indigenous ideals. The money, then, can make some communities very happy, others quite upset, as the money is not distributed equally to the communities. According to the Assembly of First Nations, or AFN, the money from these proposals cannot be spent on school libraries, sports and recreation, vocational training, First Nations languages, or school board-like services, areas that would promote a holistic learning environment. Another important point that Minnis neglects to mention when discussing funding is that the funds are given in installments that are based on business calendars and their fiscal years, April 1st to March 31st. This makes planning and implementing programs very difficult as the money does not follow the school year calendar. But once again, Minnis stated that these concerns are not validated in any way. He claims that if people put more emphasis on education and students put more effort into their work, they will succeed. And obviously I will say that this is true and many people will. However, his ideas appear to be coming from a point of privilege. Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, has stated that First Nations kids have access to the internet. They know what other students are receiving. These kids know that other kids are succeeding. The First Nations children internalize this as their own failure. Are these some of the things that Minnis considered when he was making his arguments? The last critique of the Minnis article stems from his idea that First Nations people are more successful when they are surrounded by other groups of people. For example, when they are living in cities or towns in which perhaps are very different from their home communities. Once again, this seems like an opinion coming from privilege. Minnis does not take into account the reasoning behind the movement for First Nations people. Are they moving to a different location because their home community is not receiving the basic needs for survival? These can be the availability of water, mental health professionals, doctors and nurses. Are they leaving because, as discussed earlier, their children will be properly funded to attend other provincial schools? Keep in mind that many cultural practices are lost when moving occurs. The Minnis articles seem to gloss over many significant issues surrounding First Nations people. He seemed to limit the effect that funding and mobility can have on people. I will end with a quote from Cindy Blackstock. She states that the incremental approach to equality never achieves equality. First Nations children don't have incremental childhoods.
We're really excited to discuss this more in the class discussion, but in the essence of time here, I'm just going to plant some seeds about how the knowledge that we glean from comparing the articles we looked at can be used to begin to construct a model of balance between our current educational system and the kind of completely decolonized system that Northcott envisions. While Northcott strives for 100% decolonization, his students complete his course by highlighting the need for Aboriginal literature in combination with his experimentally grounded pedagogy. And indeed, while history cannot be overlooked, the way that Minnis certainly tries to do, there will always be a question of if history had played out differently the way it was meant to, with the two cultures living side by side, helping one another, but not interfering with one another, would a balanced education system that values the pedagogies of both parties have naturally evolved and been built without all of the hostility? Possibly. As things stand, the only way, as stated in the CBC video, for us to begin to resolve the past is for Aboriginal parties to have their lands returned. This is necessary, but the whole issue is a big can of worms because, as McIntosh alluded to in the first article we read for this class, it's almost impossible for those with privilege to relinquish it in order to help someone in a position of less power, even if that power was stolen from them in the first place. Anyway, we're going to leave you with the discussion questions that we'll be using in class, so you can think about them and maybe use them to look back over the articles and form some opinions before you come to class. They're on the next slide, and we look forward to seeing everyone on Thursday night. Thank you.